Good evening, I'm Larry Hatterberg. Tonight, Cake News presents a special report about a terrifying time in Wichita and a terrible secret. The secret held captive the mind of a Wichita woman for nearly half a century. It's a secret she will share with you tonight. We call our story The Poet, the Final Verse. The poet is Ruth Finley. Her story is about a little girl. Now, before we continue, a note. This program will be aired without commercial interruption because of the nature and intensity of the story. This program contains discussions of a sexually explicit nature, and parents are forewarned that portions may not be suitable for young children. If you are concerned about the future of children, your grandchildren, or for that matter, any child, the following hour could change how you view one of society's darkest secrets, child abuse. We're telling this story to make Kansans more aware of the dangers facing our children. But first, some perspective. How did the poet get into the public eye? Cake Managing Editor Randy Brown takes us back in time to the late 1970s. Randy?
Larry, the late 1970s were very chilling times in Wichita. Many folks remember the BTK Strangler, who still hasn't been caught. By 1977, BTK had killed 7 times. Before they died, his female victims were subjected to the most vicious, violent, and vile kinds of sexual torture and degradation. And BTK was threatening to kill again and again. And then came the poet, 3 more years of terror for the city. On top of it all, the poet may have been the strangest police case in Wichita history. When it was solved in October of 1981, the Poet case was the focus of intense local and national publicity. But when it first started for police in 1978, it was a routine case. So routine it didn't generate any headlines at all.
The Poet case started, like any other case in terms of being assigned out, looking into it. Here's a lady that's got somebody harassing her, it's not uncommon, happens all the time. It's just a matter of time. It'll either stop or we'll find out who this person is.
But it didn't turn out to be quite that easy. When Ruth Finley and her husband Ed first appeared at police headquarters in November of 1978, they told of Ruth receiving a threatening letter. The letter contained an old newspaper clipping from Fort Scott from 1946. That was the year that Ruth Finley survived a rape attempt when she was just a 16-year-old girl. Ruth managed to escape the rape attempt, but the man did brand her on both thighs with a hot iron. Now, the Finleys also told police Ruth had been receiving obscene phone calls, that she had twice been harassed downtown by a strange man. The Finleys thought they were the victims of some kind of weird blackmail attempt.
At that point in time, Wichita was a very scary time for a lot of people in the city, with a lot of the things that were happening in the city.
Still, it was a routine case until November 21st, 1978, when police began working the kidnapping of Ruth Finley. That apparently ended here, just east of the Twin Lakes Shopping Center, just south of 21st Street. When Ruth finally turned up late that night, she told police she'd been grabbed off the streets of downtown Wichita, near where she worked at the Southwestern Bell Building. Then she was driven around for 4 hours before she finally managed to get away from her captors. She said she had to go to the bathroom. Ruth wasn't able to describe her kidnappers. She said they hid their faces. But she was able to tell of an old car with no back seat, but full of junk, garbage, concrete chunks, and gas cans. And police did find her sweater and shoes under these trees.
Then shortly after that, I started receiving anonymous letters in the mail, and Mrs. Finley started receiving numerous letters in the mail from an individual that was identified as the Poet.
The letters were actually a kind of terroristic poetry, promising death for Ruth Finley, referring to her as the bitch and the whore. Some were pages and pages long. Ruth once got a Valentine message from the Poet, who threatened to hang her. Here's to you, tender Valentine, red with blood and tied with twine. Nothing too much for a Valentine, gone from here by a whim of mine. Some of the poems made sense, but many of the earlier poems trailed off into unintelligible scrawls. The bottom line, though, was the same. The Poet hated Ruth Finley and was going to kill her. Yet there were some doubts about this man, the Poet.
The threats and the letters didn't make that much sense. It was a very, I guess you would say, exasperating time, trying to make head or tails of the letters to see, number one, why she was being threatened, number two, why she was kidnapped, and what this individual really had in mind that he wanted to do to her when he was able to kidnap her and take her away somewhere.
The doubts were quickly silenced in October of 1979, right here in the parking lot north of the Dillard store in Town East. Ruth Finley was stabbed 3 times. The third stab wound nearly killed her. When they got her to St. Joseph Medical Center, she had a boning knife stuck in her back nearly up to the hilt.
I think right at that spot, I think that really made people think, hey, we got a real weirdo out here on the street somewhere.
Ruth was able to give a description of her attacker this time, and a composite drawing soon brought many new leads.
This composite was on television and in the newspaper, and we received numerous phone calls from people saying, hey, I know this guy, I saw this guy, he's that guy.
After the stabbing and into 1980, the poet began to step up his attacks on the Finleys' home here on East Indianapolis near Eastgate. A bottle of urine was found on the front porch, a Molotov cocktail on the back porch. A Christmas wreath was burned in front of the Finleys' home. Eggs, rocks, and even human or animal feces were thrown at the house. The red bandana wrapping some of these messages of hate began to be the poet's greeting card, and the poems continued to Ruth, the police, Cake TV, and the Eagle Beacon.
At nights, we had heavy security on their home. We had television cameras, surveillance cameras, undercover officers, and many a night we've gone over and just sat with the Finleys, hoping during the investigation that this individual would come back to the house, which there was numerous times things left at the house indicating that he had been there. So, of course, we stayed close, hoping that we could catch him coming back.
But you never saw anything. The surveillance never saw anything.
Never saw
the neighbors
anything.
never saw anything.
Never.
Bernie Drawatsky is now the Kay County, Oklahoma undersheriff. But then he was a Wichita police officer, perhaps the officer closest to the poet case. He and his wife spent many hours with Ed and Ruth Finley, looking for a break in the case.
Both are probably two of the nicest individuals I've ever met in my life. Ed and Ruth are just super people. I consider them today as very close personal friends. They're people that you can be around and be totally comfortable with, whether it's in their home or whether it's in a cafe where the Finleys and my wife and I have gone and had supper together during the investigation of the poet. They're just common, very decent, nice people.
Nice as the Finleys were, as the poems and threats rolled in, the heat was on down at police headquarters. Frustration and political pressure for an arrest were growing.
Pressures being put on supervisors. Supervisors are putting pressure on investigators. News people are inquiring as to what are you people doing? You know, don't you have anybody that can help this lady? I mean, everyone was fearful, thinking, you know, this could be me. This is just a nice lady in our city that has been being subjected to, you know, for whatever reason, to this torment, this torture. We felt very genuinely that this lady's life was in danger. There was no question in the investigator's mind. I kept bringing people in. I remember I brought Mike Hill in, you know, and I asked him, and I set him down. I said, Mike, are you sure? Have we done everything? Are you positive? And I talked to Drawatsky, and I talked to the other guys, and they kept saying, Chief, I tell you, we're doing everything humanly possible.
And still the poems came. Then the poet made a mistake. The poet threatened Chief LeMunyon's wife, Sharon, and LeMunyon decided to take charge. He also decided he didn't want to meet Ruth Finley.
I wanted no emotion. I wanted no personal input. I could see that several of the detectives had gotten attached to Ruth. She was very likable. They wanted to believe her. They wanted to believe Ruth.
They were too close to the case?
Absolutely, absolutely too close to the case. And that was not going to happen to me. My wife had been threatened. I'm going to find out, if I can, who threatened her, and we're going to play this right down the middle.
LeMunyon had read all 14 volumes of evidence on the case, and on September 11th, 1981, here at the county courthouse, LeMunyon called a secret meeting of all the top officers involved. LeMunyon had become convinced that one of the Finleys, or both, was responsible for the poet.
She just had to be involved in it. I didn't care what the medical doctor said or what the psychologist said. It just didn't make sense for Ruth not to be involved in it.
Had a lot of people that totally disagreed that, hey, there ain't no way they can be doing this. There is not a way possible that the Finleys can be involved. And you had probably about as many officers that could say, well, yeah, there's a possibility they could.
And so at the conclusion of the meeting, I announced that I would take over personal control of the case, and that effective immediately there would be a 24-hour surveillance on Ruth and Ed, and that we were either going to prove one way or the other that either Ruth Finley was the poet and involved in the case, or she was not. And that was probably the most intense 3 weeks that we've had.
The secret surveillance was on the Finleys everywhere, including Ruth's office at Southwestern Bell, and results weren't long in coming. Evidence, including carbon paper bearing the poet's printing and torn scraps of a Big Chief tablet with the poet's writing on them, turned up right where Ruth worked. In those final weeks, the poet seemed to get even more frenzied, sometimes making several threats every day. The most damaging evidence came here at Eastgate, near the west entrance to the shopping center. Now, there used to be a mail drop right over here. In September of 1981, Wichita police detectives watched from across the street in the parking lot of the Hilton East as the Finleys drove up.
Actually, Ed was driving the car. Ruth was on the passenger side, mailed the letters, and there were 5 letters. In the 2 inner letters, there was a bill, then a poet letter, another bill, another poet letter, and then another bill. One of the poet letters in this case was mailed to Cake TV. One of the letters was mailed to Ruth Finley.
October 1st, 1981. Police make their final move. They bring the Finleys to police headquarters.
We called Ed in first and took him from his workplace. Unbeknownst to Ruth, confronted him with the facts, and it became very apparent, quite apparent, that the man, he was shattered. He obviously had no knowledge that this was his wife that was doing this.
He was convinced.
He was convinced his wife had almost been killed, harassed. He had seen the letters. He had seen the wires cut on his home. He had seen a fire start in his front door. You know, he had been there. He had lived through this. This is his wife of many years. He was convinced there was someone else out there. So when he was told, he was shattered.
Then Bernie Drowatsky brought Ruth Finley into the 5th floor interrogation room at police headquarters. Sheriff Mike Hill, then a police captain, began to question her and confront her with the overwhelming evidence.
And at times he would get real tough, just, you know, and then he'd play on her emotions a little while, and then he played to her sympathy, and then he'd get tough with her again. And then she finally, after some time, finally just shook her head and said, I don't know why I did it. I don't know why. After some time, she just, you could barely hear her as we were listening, but you could barely hear her say that she was crying at this point, that she didn't know why she did it. She just, Mike said, just dropped her head and cried and shook and said she was sorry. She's so sorry that she put everyone through it.
And the case of the poet that began as such a routine case was over.
Good evening. There appears to be a major break in the poet case.
Wichita police at this hour are interrogating a suspect in the case, and TV 10 News has learned that that suspect is Ruth Finley herself.
Ruth Finley admitted all the poet's activities, though police think there may have been a grain of truth to the early harassment. Ruth had written more than 230 of the hate-filled letters and committed scores of other threatening and sometimes violent acts against herself. No charges were ever filed in the poet case because Ruth voluntarily went for psychiatric treatment. The investigation involved hundreds of officers and cost Wichita taxpayers at least $370,000. Even though many officers were frustrated, embarrassed that they didn't uncover Ruth's secret much sooner, they certainly bear her no ill will. In fact, every officer I talked to said he was very happy that she finally got the help she needed. But they all still have the same question. Why did she do it? What happened in Ruth Finley's past to create the poet? Larry?
Randy, what do the police think? Do they have any suppositions?
Well, several officers I talked to, Larry, thought that perhaps it was the incident in Fort Scott in 1946 when Ruth was only 16 years old. Maybe that triggered the poet. But Chief LeMunyon thinks that it happened very, very much earlier in Ruth's childhood.
Well, Randy, Chief LeMunyon was right. Why has haunted not only the police, but Ruth Finley herself. Now, for the first time, Ruth Finley tells her story. We talked to Ruth a few weeks ago, and accompanying her was Dr. Andrew Pickens. For the past 6 years, Dr. Pickens has had Ruth as a patient. Dr. Pickens is a Wichita psychiatrist in the private practice of adult and adolescent psychiatry. He's also associated with Great Plains Hospital.
Hickory dickory dock, the hands fell off the clock. Run, run from the man and get away. My legs are gone, so I have to stay. The potty was warm and red. Hide the mess on the bed. I hate him. He feels like a railroad track.
Those lines of poetry come from the mind of Ruth Finley. They describe an event in her life when she was 3.5 years old, an event so horrible that her mind refused to remember until therapy brought it back 50 years later. Ruth's story begins 5 decades ago in a rural part of Missouri. The year was 1933. Her dad was a farmer, her mother a homemaker, and she had an older brother. We begin the interview as Ruth describes her parents.
He was a big man, he was tall, thin. I wasn't thin, he was not. He was a tall man. Sure. Very quiet, kind of reserved. He was nice. I think I was sort of special to him. Well, he liked me when I was a little girl. He'd take me with him and go places. Mm-hmm. No, you could tell he did. She was very hardworking. Mm-hmm. She was kind. She took very good care of us. Only she wasn't one to, neither one of them were ones to show you a lot of emotion. You know, they wasn't a lot of hugging and this kind of stuff. They just mostly thought you understood, that they cared for you.
Ruth's parents are now deceased. A mile or so down the road from Ruth lived a neighbor who was to figure prominently in Ruth's life.
The first memory I have of him, and this was not a hidden memory, I always remember this. We were at their house, it was at night with my folks, and they were in their kitchen visiting, and for some reason he picked me up and took me to their bedroom and tied me to the end of the bed with a rope and went off and left me. And of course I started to cry. And when my folks heard me, they came and got me. But I got in trouble because I cried because he was just playing with me. But I always remembered that. So I was always sort of afraid of him. But on the other hand, he was nice to me. So see, I didn't really know just how to take him. Well, sometimes he would like to take me with him, and he's under the pretense of, one time it was to show off my pretty dress. So he would be complimentary to me sometimes. One time, I was in the car with my dad, and for some reason, my dad was going somewhere, and he said, well, I'll keep her for you. My dad said, fine. That time was the time I was in the car with my dad, and he picked me up, because like 3.5, you're not too big, and carried me in the house. And we went, there wasn't anyone else in the house, and we went, he took me to their bedroom, and we were going to play a little game. We were going to play, it was like hide the thimble, except it was hide the key. It was one of those skeleton keys. First he would hide it, which was silly because he hid it right in front of me. I could find it. Then he started dropping it, putting it in my clothes. Then he would put it in his pocket and have me find it. Then I had on a pair of coveralls, striped coveralls. And he dropped it down in my coveralls. and decided that he would have to find it. So he took off my coveralls, and then he took off my panties, and that's how that incident started. Do you want to hear more of the incident?
I think to establish what the problem is and how deep it went, I think it's important.
Okay. Well, I didn't like him. And see, I did not remember. This was one thing that came out in therapy, were these memories. I did not remember this. He took me to the bed, and I was not a very receptive person. I guess I didn't want him to put me on the bed. So he tied my hands with a handkerchief or something, and tied me to it was a metal, those iron bed frames, to the bed. And I was making a lot of noise. So he took a red bandana, dirty one, out of his pocket, and he stuck it in my mouth, which did keep me quiet. I guess it didn't keep me quiet enough, because then I have a pillow on my head. And then he proceeded, I guess you would just, proper word be, to rape me, which was very painful, very scary. And after he was through, then he took the pillow off my head and the bandana out of my mouth, and then I got it in the mouth, which in therapy I had these horrible memories of like eating my own blood. This seemed very, I guess when I was 3 and a half, very bad to me. Sure. To have to do this. And at the end of that, he seemed to be angry at this time. When he would do this would make me ill. And I threw up in the bed. But somehow that very first time, I somehow was able to escape. Part of me, I could see this little girl, I floated off to heaven. I was like floating. To me, a little girl in heaven was just up in the sky, in the clouds. And this memory I have, I was dressed in like an angel in white. But I was just up there, but I could see what was happening to this little girl. And pretty soon I couldn't stand it any longer, so I had to go back and help her out. But I don't know, somehow, it wasn't so bad if it wasn't me, I was just watching it. So somehow that I could do that.
So, at 3.5 years old, the only way Ruth's mind could cope with the rapes was to have her mind on another plane, closing off what terrible thing was happening to her. Then, more incidents. Ruth had just come from church. She had on a new Easter dress. The neighbor dropped by to see her.
I don't know why he came by, but he said my dress was pretty. He wanted to show it to his wife. But I clung to my mother's dress, hid behind her screaming, and she kind of smacked my legs and said, go on and show her your dress. So he picked me up and took me to the car. He put me, I remember none of these incidents except after I got in therapy. But when he put me in the front seat, I remember going over the back seat, over into the back seat. But he grabbed my feet and pulled my shoes off. But I rode to their house in the back seat. And when we got there, he opened the door and I ran. Unfortunately, I ran into some weeds where there were lots of stickers and was captured. He took me to the barn. I wouldn't quit crying. He became very angry. But again, I floated off and watched it happen. But then when I would come back, I always felt guilty that if I'd have stayed, I could have helped out this little girl. This really doesn't make much sense. But this time when I wouldn't quit crying, he picked me up and we went out the back of the barn. I had my eyes shut until he was going to put me on the ground. And I was sort of just going down head first. And I got a whiff of something. This really isn't easy to talk about.
I understand.
But
Take your time.
he stuck my head down into a dead animal. I don't exactly know what it was. Like, it must have been there a while. And he said, maybe you'll learn to keep your mouth shut. Which this really made me sick. But then he took me and washed my face. And it seemed to be sorry he'd done it, because this time I just kept throwing up. But again, he would just put my clothes back on me this time. At this point, he was like taking care of me afterwards. Like he would put my clothes on me.
At this point, it's easy to wonder about her parents. Why didn't they see what was happening? Why didn't they listen to the cries of a little girl? Well, to understand them is to understand the times in which they lived. Children in the 1930s were to be seen and not heard. Because of the Depression, self-reliance was considered a virtue. Ruth was seen as a crybaby. The more she clung to her mother, the more her mother pushed her to become independent.
My mother always, you had to be perfect. You know, she didn't want you doing anything, and I'm sure I thought I was guilty and would get in trouble. My mother was very religious, and somehow I got the idea that God watched everything you did. And he had a book and he wrote it down, his black book. Somehow she must have told me this. So I figured my book was getting pretty full, you know, with what he was jotting down on me. But, and if you did something, it would be like you embarrassed her. I think my mother probably did everything she did for me that she thought was best. I think she thought to break me of my crying, she should be a little stern and push me away. And it seemed the more I clung, the more she pushed. My folks I was born in the Depression. They were very poor. My mother was a very hard worker, and they were good to us. They gave us a good home. They just didn't ever pick me up and hug me and say, "Why are you crying?"
As Ruth continued to be molested, her mind turned a book of innocent children's poems into stories about herself.
My aunt had given me a little poetry book. It was one of those long, narrow. It had the poem, there was a little girl who had a little curl, because when I was little, I was a thumb sucker and twisted my curl. So this was sort of referred to me. And one day, I couldn't read, of course, but this book had been read to me, so I knew the poems by the pictures. But I was in the yard all alone with my book, and all of a sudden the poems were all about me, but they were all bad. They'd all turned, and I knew if anyone saw the book, they'd know what a bad little girl I was. So I ran and I hid the book. There was like a pile of fence posts, and I kept sticking the book in there till I couldn't see it any longer, so no one could read it. I knew that it was bad and nobody cared, because if they did, someone would, when I screamed for them, would come help me out.
Doctor, when you first entered into therapy, what did Mrs. Finley tell you about her childhood? How did she describe it?
She kind of glossed over it. She just basically said it was a normal childhood, a basically happy, loving family in which there were no particular problems.
A Leave It to Beaver type of family,
Exactly.
I think, as you characterized it. Is this normal?
It is common in this kind of situation where all painful things must be blocked off. But I would say it's fairly normal among the general population. This is also what makes something like this particularly difficult. As children, we're dependent on the caregivers, usually our parents. So it's very difficult for us to be critical of them, even into adulthood. And that's carried on now. People don't like to see things that are critical of parents, even if they're valid.
I would scream when I was crying. I would call for my dad. Somehow I got the impression that everyone knew this was happening and nobody cared because nobody did anything about it. I think I thought they wanted me to die. Of course, that wasn't true. They didn't know what was going on.
She felt the burden of having to be a perfect and good child, that her mother would not tolerate her unless she was always happy, and considered any sign of pain or discomfort as an annoyance, and sometimes as a bad reflection on her. In other words, if she had a daughter crying all the time, that made it look like, to the neighbors and family, like she was a bad mother.
The rapes continued over a 3 to 6 month period, and through therapy, Ruth remembered another incident in the barn when again she was raped.
And when he was through, he was sitting out on like a milk stool, a little stool. And he, I thought, was crying. Well, I'd never seen a man cry. Now, to this day, I don't know whether he was crying or whether he was putting me on. But this little girl, that was me, saw him crying, walked up to him, and patted him on the shoulder. I thought it was my fault he was crying, but it was a mistake. Because the minute I patted him, he grabbed me and did it again, which didn't do much for a little girl trying to comfort someone. I was at my grandmother's. I'd gone with my dad, and I was carrying this doll sort of by the arm, and he came up, and I started crying when I saw him, and he took my hand and told me to shut up. Then he took my doll, and he said, "This is what happens to little girls that don't do what they're told." And he pulled the doll's head off, which was easy to do. It was a little, but he fixed it back. Well, I think in my mind I'd seen chickens killed on the farm, and I didn't want to go that way, floundering around, dying.
Then the visits to the neighbor stopped. During her therapy sessions with Dr. Pickens, Ruth took her older brother, who remembered a conversation between her mother and father.
And he remembered one time our folks were discussing, and he said, "It seemed to me this could have been it, because my mother was telling my dad, 'You go ask him.' And my dad said, 'He wouldn't do anything like that,' and walked off. But somehow my brothers and I remember that we didn't see much of them after that. That could have been what stopped it.
The memories from the mind of Ruth Finley came back only through intensive therapy. During most of her adult life, she remembered none of the incidents. Because they were so horrible, her mind repressed them. It was only after police discovered she was the poet that the therapy sessions began with Dr. Andrew Pickens. The therapy used to extract these memories is called psychoanalytic psychotherapy. The basis for treatment is that the recognition that the human mind can have unconscious mental functioning. Fears, feelings, and emotional conflicts rooted in childhood can, if they are sufficiently intense, lead to psychological problems during adulthood, and that's what happened to Ruth Finley. And it could happen to any of us. But what is most revealing are the poems Ruth wrote during those therapy sessions as her mind began to remember. When first written, these poems were for no one but herself. They are so private and personal, yet give us a rare insight into the mind of a very scared 4-year-old girl. Though this poem was written by Ruth Finley, the adult, the feelings and language are that of a 4-year-old girl.
Legs are straight and like a clock I see, big hand at 9 and little one on 3.
Hickory dickory dock, The hands fell off the clock. Run, run from the man and get away. My legs are gone, so I have to stay. The potty was warm and red. Hide the mess on the bed. I hate him. He feels like a railroad track. A rotten kid is what he said. Please don't, it hurts so much. I know I am dead. My teeth are gone and in their place. This giant snake all over my face. I'm dying, I hope I die. All the stink and noise and hurt. Bad stuff to eat in my mouth. It is rotten and nasty and I want some air in my daddy. Where is he? I want to get the book so no one will know what a bad girl I am. I am a bad girl. Why is he hurting me? I want to go away. I want to die. He will kill me. I want my mother to hug me, but she won't. All this in my mouth to eat. I can't eat it. I need to throw up. I'm choking to death. I hate him. I wish he would die, too. I wish I had my hands. I want my daddy. I'll get a whipping for throwing up in the bed.
I can't help it. I'm a bad girl. I'm dead.
Doctor, when you first heard these poems and they first came out, were you surprised at the depth of the poems?
I don't know that I was surprised. My main reaction was that I was very moved by them. Mrs. Finley is an intelligent woman. It didn't surprise me that a child would feel this way, but I was moved by this view, this very clear-cut view of what she felt like and what she went through.
Now, what happened to Mrs. Finley could happen to anyone. Is that true? Who has such a significant situation occur in their life?
Yes.
I mean, all of us could go the way she went if the situation were close.
That's correct.
In the time that you've been practicing, how unusual is this particular case?
I would say, as I said before, the exact form of it is quite unusual, and what's particularly unusual and I think valuable is that Mrs. Finley's poems that she wrote during therapy gives us a window on the mind and feelings of a child who's being abused. As an adult, she's able to give voice to what she couldn't say as a little girl. And because these feelings and memories were buried away, they are now very fresh. When she was reliving these in therapy, it was as if they had happened yesterday, just like a fossil that's been frozen and preserved for thousands of years. So this was very fresh, and it gives us an idea of what a small child feels, the terror, the horror, and the tremendous emotional pain.
After her parents ended the contacts with the neighbor, Ruth's childhood might be considered normal. Then, at age 16, Ruth's parents sent her to Fort Scott, Kansas to finish out high school. She stayed in a boarding house near the railroad tracks. After school, she worked for the phone company. One evening, Ruth came home and found a man hiding in her room. He tried to rape her, but didn't succeed. Instead, he branded her with a hot iron on her thighs. Another traumatic experience. The Fort Scott Tribune put her story on the front page, headlined, "Sex Maniac Uses Flat Irons in Branding Local High School Girl." The paper used Ruth's name and, in some editions, her picture. Ruth was embarrassed and humiliated. In 1950, Ruth married Ed Finley. They moved to Wichita, raised 2 sons, and from all accounts, led a normal middle-class life here in the city. Then, in 1977, her life began to change. Her husband was hospitalized for what they thought was a heart attack. It wasn't. But during Ed's hospital stay, Ruth received a phone call at home.
The man started out friendly, like, was I Ruth Smock from Fort Scott, which I thought was a long-lost friend. Then he started asking me about this incident, and it was, what is the gist of it was, he was going to want some money from me, or he was going to tell this again, which upset me. But now looking back, I shouldn't have been upset over it.
This was the attempted rape in Fort Scott.
Which would have been in the paper, so, you know, it wasn't any, but he was going to bring it up again.
Doctor, in your therapy, do you think that telephone call was a key?
Yes, I do. Coming at the time that it did, when Mrs. Finley was separated from her husband, concerned about his health. I think not just that incident, but the context in which it occurred.
So there were several things going on in Ruth's life at that point. Her husband was ill. It had the possibility of being a serious illness, a telephone call from the past. What happens in the mind at this point, from your point of view, to make the past that's been repressed for so long start to come forward?
Well, these feelings, because they're intense, and the nature of the feelings themselves, even as a little girl, when she buried this, she wanted help, as you could see in the poems. So all along, there is an internal pressure for these feelings to come to the surface. What maintains the repression is the sense of the wish not to experience, re-experience those painful feelings. Anything that reminds the person of a traumatic event is liable to stimulate or start to stimulate a memory. And I believe that this is what happened. And also, not only was there this sense of being threatened and reminded of the attempted rape when she was 16, but there is a sense of feeling afraid, alone, abandoned because of her husband's illness, just as she felt abandoned and afraid as a little girl.
Okay. Ruth, the phone calls taper off. Ed gets out of the hospital. He did not have a heart attack. Life starts to go back to normal, but not really for you. At that point, what happened?
Along in there somewhere, I started getting poems from the poet, which I think we've all decided I wrote them all. Now, I don't remember writing them all. I have some memories of writing some down by our washing machine. But you know, there were a lot of them. I don't know when or how I did all this.
You have no recollection at all of but just snippets, kind of like a snapshot, a camera shutter that'll show you glimpses into your past of you writing this. At what point, or did you, until the time that the police took you into custody, did you ever, in the time in between, realize that something bad was happening, other than the fact that there was this person or persons terrorizing you?
No. The day they picked me up and took me, it seems to me, I would have been scared to death when they said, you know, we're going to take you over to look at some pictures. Even when they took me to the questioning room and were reading me my rights, I thought they were joking. They weren't.
And yet, you were the poet. You were the person that was terrorizing yourself. Doctor, I guess a question comes to mind. How can a person do this? Obviously, Ruth did it, was always been living with her husband, went to work every day. It's like there were two people. Explain this. This is hard for most of us to understand.
Well, first let me say she really wasn't terrorizing herself. She was trying to get help for and protect herself from the terror that she experienced as a little girl. What we call a dissociative episode, where she was no longer, when she was in a state of altered consciousness, was similar to what she did when she was being raped as a little girl.
This is leaving your body and watching everything happen below.
Exactly, although it was more complete at this point. So in a sense, she did things that consciously she could no longer remember. She left herself and in a sense became another person, but it wasn't a coherent person. It wasn't really a separate personality. Now the intent was to get help, just like she wanted to get help when she was a little girl. She did feel threatened, but it wasn't a current threat. She was re-experiencing the feelings from when she was a little girl. But at the same time that she wanted to get help, she didn't want to reveal what it was she wanted to get help for, because she didn't want to relive these painful experiences from her childhood.
Because she would still be considered a bad girl?
Exactly. Well, and the reliving itself was very painful. It would be like it was happening right then.
Ruth, as this was going on, were there any hints to you from yourself, I guess is the best way to put it, that something wasn't right? Did you ever have any hints along the line?
I think toward the end I did.
And how?
Well, I became very set on killing myself. I had this was myself, not the poet. I had this very good set of plans worked out. I had money in my purse that I could carry out what I was going to do. And it seemed like the more, I guess, depressed I got, the happier I appeared.
Why did you want to kill yourself? Did you think at that point, was it because of what the alleged poet was doing to you, or I'm a little unclear there.
I don't know. It just seemed the thing I had to do. But the way I wanted to do it, see, I was going away. I had the money and the schedule on the bus, knew where I was going. Now, probably if the poet had been part of me that was a poet, I could have carried it out. But as myself, I was afraid I'd get caught.
Essentially what was happening when Mrs. Finley wanted to kill herself is that she was recapturing the feelings from when she was 3½ without recapturing the memory. So she had no sensible cause for those feelings, but didn't make any difference. They were so intense. Just as when she was 3½ years old, she once again wanted to die, to be away from all of the pain and confusion.
From a medical point of view, at what level was she operating as the poet, both age-wise and mentally?
Well, the motivation and emotional level was as though she was a child, a 3½-year-old child. But she had adult abilities to act on those feelings and fears and conflicts of the 3½-year-old within her.
So the mobility of an adult and basically the mind of a 3½-year-old going back and reliving these things.
And the intelligence of an adult. So that was why she could keep from being found out.
Then the moment when Ruth's life fell apart. Police arrive at the phone company to take Ruth Finley into custody.
No, that was a very bad evening in my life at the police station, because I just sort of, it was like I couldn't quite figure out what was wrong with me, that I surely hadn't done all this.
And they were confronting you with evidence.
And it was like after he showed me the picture, it was coming back, it was coming in my mind, some of the things I had done. And it was sort of, it was very embarrassing, humiliating. I really wanted to kill myself then, but I knew why. But at that point, I thought I wanted to because I was such a bad person.
I think you felt for a long time, and this probably came out in therapy, that people had a negative image of you because of the poet situation. And I think one of the reasons we're in front of the cameras right now is because you wanted to correct that negative image.
And I'm sure there's people, business associates of my husband's, people I work with, our neighbors and friends, people that wondered what on earth is wrong with her. But maybe if I explained my life a little, they would understand, because I've changed my opinion of myself during therapy. I don't think I'm a bad person like I did. I understand that this little girl that had her problems, you know, she just was kind of put on hold and acted up a little, and maybe people would understand about her. Well, that was me. There I go again. That was me as a little girl. They would understand maybe there was a reason I did what I did, because I hate to have people think, you know, oh, she was just out having a good time, because I really wasn't. And when you think about stabbing yourself, That's carrying it pretty far.
That's a question that a lot of people have. It's an interesting point you bring up. Do you recall at all stabbing yourself?
That's one thing in therapy one incident we worked on about the poet. And the whole thing happened just almost as I said it did, except for one thing. I stabbed myself. But when I remember it, it's as if it still seems I was fighting with someone by the car. It happened in Townie's parking lot, and I did drive to this filling station and call the police, and I drove home with a knife in my side, just like it was reported.
They were deep wounds. You had to have surgery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I bruised my kidney with one shot.
How does that happen, doctor? How can you inflict deep wounds and not have a recollection of the pain?
Same way people can undergo major surgery under hypnosis. Exactly the same way. An altered state of consciousness. This was a state similar to self-hypnosis. And of course, the battle was not between Mrs. Finley and an assailant, but the real battle was within Mrs. Finley. And stabbing herself was an expression of the rage as a child, of the wish to get away from it all, and also the feelings of self-loathing that she had as a little girl that are depicted in the poem.
The therapy reached a turning point when Ruth remembered another rape by the neighbor. In his own brutal way, he left the 3.5-year-old with her clothes over her head on a dirty wooden floor of the barn. The child wanted to die. Remembering this as an adult in therapy, Ruth found that only she could rescue this little girl, thus ending a lifelong saga.
It seemed urgent to me that someone go rescue her, me, as a 3.5-year-old. I wished Dr. Pickens would go get her. And he called it to my attention that I was the only one that could get her. So we did this, worked with this several sessions. Finally got her. It was as if she were on the floor beside me. But I could never quite make her part of me. But I felt awfully bad that no one would help her out. But finally, one day, it was like I accepted her, and she was on the couch with me, had become part of me. And it was like I would tell her that I would always take care of her. If no one else would, I would.
How do you feel about that little girl now?
Well, I kind of like her. I think she did okay.
It's important not just for Mrs. Finley, the adult, but for the little girl within her, to get the objectively true message that every step of the way she's been a victim. She was a victim when she was 3.5, and she was a victim when she performed the activities as the poet. And because people didn't know about the background, and she didn't even know about the background that contributed to this, she didn't look like a victim at the end. She looked like a victimizer, and she was not.
This is a hard question for me to ask because of everything you've been through. But the poet was not real. How do we know that what happened to you when you were 3.5 was actually real? That's a question that people will ask. Ruth, how would you respond to that?
But I think the way the things I remembered them, and the details I remember, I'm sure they're real. But people would have to be their own judge, you know.
What proof do you have, Doctor? What would you say to answer that criticism?
I also might add that Mrs. Finley's been in therapy for a total of approximately 5 years. She was in therapy for 4 years and out of therapy for a year. And other memories started to come back, and she came back in therapy last year. You don't do that as a lark. It's expensive, it's painful, it's difficult. This has been 2 hours a week. We probably spent about 500 hours together. At no time was any medication used in her treatment.
Is the poet dead at this point?
Oh, I think so. Yes, I would say so. Wouldn't you?
Yes, definitely.
Ruth Finley shared her story tonight to help others, other children and adults who may be experiencing abuse, either sexually or physically. Don't cry for Ruth Finley. Her nightmare is over. Ruth and her husband Ed are happily married and looking towards the future. Instead, cry for a society that permits this abuse, a society that day after day closes its eyes to the cries of children. There is help available. If you are being abused or if you know of someone who is, here are some people who can help. Right now at the Sedgwick County Department of Mental Health, counselors are standing by at these numbers, 268-8251 or 686-7465. At the Wichita Area Sexual Assault Center, help is also available. Their number is 263-0185 or 263-3002. If you know of a child who is being abused or harmed in any way, you can also call the Wichita Police Department's Exploited and Missing Children's Unit. They too are standing by for your call. That number is 268-7094. These numbers will be repeated during the Cake News 10 o'clock edition immediately following this program. In closing, I'd like to thank Ruth Finley and Dr. Andrew Pickens. Ruth for sharing her innermost secrets with us tonight so that finally people might understand the real reason behind the birth of the poet. And our thanks to Dr. Andrew Pickens, the Wichita psychiatrist associated with Great Plains Hospital who helped make this extraordinary program possible. Finally, Ruth Finley's poems during her therapy are a fascinating look at the human mind. We close with excerpts from one of them, a poem we might call The Final Verse.
I hope my venture penetrates every human heart. Dedicated to a little girl and an understanding doctor who let her start. No one knew her well, this I regret. She drew away because no one wanted close to get. Deaf and this little girl were such good friends. I'd like to invite everyone to be here in the heart of this little girl and feel her fear. Come into the heart of this little girl who was so bad, offended everyone with her crying and being sad. In her place would you have been brave and bold, the terrors on your tongue but never told. She asked for nothing, so nothing was denied, offended everyone by the way she cried. In her heart she could never be sure whether either of us could endure. Why was I alone? I should have been found, and she knew God was nowhere around. You all sat idly by and stared. If you were forced to eat your own blood, would you have cared? Remember she was little, and her sins might have been less if someone had taken her dirty hand in her time of distress. She had judged the world as not too fair, full of people who didn't want to care. Maybe someone will notice she was absent from the human race, never there, but always in her place.